Welcome back to the open ground, the Gestalt Shift, a peripheral exploration. Section 1. The pattern that reveals itself. When viewed from sufficient altitude, the Western intellectual tradition does not appear as a sequence of competing systems, but as a single iterative operation, performed in multiple idioms. Across centuries, under the conviction that each idiom represents an origin. The operation is simple, nearly invisible in its familiarity. To take what is inherently relational and render it autonomous. To extract the dynamic from the network and enthrone it as foundation. Once performed, this move produces hierarchy, metaphysics, and the long afterlife of their consequences. Plato initiates the archetype. In the Republic, the form of the good is placed above all things, not within them. It becomes a light source external to the relational interplay of forms. Knowledge, in turn, is conceived as ascent toward that externality. The relational act of understanding is recoded as participation in transcendence. The good, which in lived human experience is always mediated through relation, between persons, acts, and contexts, is abstracted into the timeless and unconditioned. From that point onward, Western thought learns the habit. Each epoch reenacts the same gesture with new vocabulary. Descartes divides mind and matter, locating certainty in the cogito, and treating the extended world as derivative. Kant replays the move by isolating the categories of understanding from the flux of phenomena. Experience becomes intelligible only through an apparatus situated outside it. Hegel performs an inverted variation. The absolute absorbs the relational process, but by declaring the absolute as telos, he once again positions it as ontologically prior. Nietzsche rejects the Platonic elevation of the good only to externalize another principle, the will to power. What in lived existence manifests as reciprocal tension among forces becomes a metaphysical drive that precedes them. Heidegger exposes the forgetting of being as the West's deepest wound, yet his own project situates being as ontological ground, distinct from beings themselves. Even when the thinker attempts reunion, the operation persists. Relation is noticed, then removed for safekeeping, then treated as the source of the relations it transcends. Across these cases, the continuity is structural, not doctrinal. Each thinker identifies a vital term: good, mind, reason, spirit, will, being, recognizes its centrality within relational experience, extracts it, and builds an edifice around its isolation. The act is recursive. Every system that follows must either defend the externalization or invent new techniques to bridge the gap it created. Scholastic theology attempts to mediate between God and creation. Enlightenment empiricism tries to reconcile mind and matter. Existentialism seeks to reunite being and beings. Each reconciliation is a reformulation of the same fracture. The phenomenon is not restricted to metaphysics. When science separates observer from observed, it mirrors the Platonic form in experimental logic. When economics abstracts value from labor and ecology, it repeats Cartesian division through market mechanism. When psychology divides conscious from unconscious, it institutionalizes dualism as diagnostic method. What began as an intellectual posture becomes civilizational instinct, a learned reflex of abstraction. To see the pattern, one must suspend the disciplinary lens and trace the form of the move itself. Plato, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger are not adversaries in a philosophical genealogy. They are stages in the maturation of an epistemic code. The continuity among them is not agreement but structure. Each generation inherits the same binary: immanent and transcendent, relational and foundational, and recasts it to suit the current vocabulary of legitimacy. Even critiques of externalization are usually performed from within its grammar. The recognition of this pattern does not diminish the thinkers, it situates them. It reveals that their conflicts are internal differentials, within a shared architecture. What appears as a succession of revolutions, idealism, materialism, phenomenology, is a single iterative process refining its own externalization. Western philosophy, in this light, becomes not the pursuit of truth, but the refinement of separation. Once this becomes visible, the task shifts from analysis to recognition. The question ceases to be which thinker was correct, and becomes what operation do they share. The point of the Gestalt shift is this recognition. When the reader perceives the sameness of the operation across figures, the frame of evaluation collapses, and the pattern, previously invisible precisely because it was everywhere, emerges as the condition of the entire canon. Section 2. The structural operation of externalization. The operation that underlies Western civilization's intellectual architecture can be stated with clarity. Externalization is the act of abstracting a relational process from its contextual field, reifying that abstraction into a principle, and then treating that principle as the causal or explanatory source of the field it was removed from. It is a reversal of direction. What was effect becomes cause. What was emergent becomes fundamental. Once this inversion occurs, the system built on it requires endless maintenance. Theory, theology, or policy must continually work to reconcile the abstraction with the reality it once described. This section defines that operation as a structural grammar, an identifiable cognitive and an institutional pattern that repeats across philosophy, science, and politics. 1. Cognitive origin. The cognitive root of externalization lies in the human tendency toward object formation. Perception isolates features from the environment in order to act upon them. This is adaptive at the perceptual scale, but becomes distortive at the conceptual scale, when the operation of isolation is mistaken for ontological revelation. Where relational continuity exists between body and environment, subject and object, agent and field, thought imposes partitions for the sake of clarity. The partition then becomes the foundation of explanation. Kant formalized this habit when he separated phenomena, what appears within the relational field of experience, from noumena, the supposed things in themselves. His critical turn safeguarded experience but also institutionalized the gap. After Kant, philosophy became the management of that gap rather than its dissolution. 2. Ontological formalization. Once an abstraction is externalized, it undergoes ontological promotion. Plato's good becomes not a property within relations, but the source of all relational intelligibility. Descartes' thinking substance becomes not one participant in a continuum, but a distinct realm, with its own causal integrity. Hegel's Geist functions as the absolute that produces relation, rather than emerging from it. This pattern creates what can be termed a hierarchical recursion. A concept derived from relation is reinserted as the origin of that relation. The conceptual product becomes the metaphysical producer. This inversion generates a self-sustaining structure of explanation. Because the abstraction is posited as source, any contradiction within the relational world is explained by reference to the externalized principle's hidden logic. Philosophy thus perpetuates itself through the maintenance of its own displacement. 3. Institutional reinforcement. With the rise of modern science, externalization became institutional. Francis Bacon's program of control over nature required separation of observer and observed. Galileo's mathematical formalism codified phenomena as law-like behaviors independent of perception. By the time of Newton, nature was not a dynamic interplay, but a closed system governed by immutable external laws. This scientific ontology reintroduced the Platonic form under empirical disguise. The law stood outside the event as its explanation. The Enlightenment's political theory mirrored this logic. Sovereignty was externalized as contract, reason as universal arbiter, and the individual as atom of social composition. Hobbes and Locke disagreed about the nature of the sovereign, but both agreed that order originates from a position outside relation, be it the Leviathan or the rational individual. The architecture of liberalism, socialism, and even contemporary neoliberalism inherits this frame. The external principle, state, market, or rational agent, legitimizes the relational web it transcends. 4. Self-reinforcing feedback. Externalization sustains itself through what can be called problem generation feedback. Each abstraction, once removed from relation, creates discrepancies that the next intellectual generation must address. The separation of mind and body generates dualism. Dualism invites idealism and materialism. Their conflict demands synthesis. The synthesis reestablishes the abstraction in another form. This feedback mechanism ensures continuity. The intellectual system never collapses because its contradictions are productive. They generate new disciplines, new vocabularies, new institutions to mediate the same structural rift. The proliferation of academic specialization since the 19th century is a macro-scale expression of this process. Each field is an attempt to repair a fracture that another field produced, yet all operate on the same premise of separation. 5. Relational cost. The practical consequence is a civilizational loss of relational literacy. When the operation of externalization becomes invisible, every domain assumes its validity. Politics treats citizens as discrete units rather than interdependent actors. Economics models value as if divorced from ecology. Psychology isolates individuals from cultural feedback loops. Theology segregates the sacred from the material. Each discipline maintains coherence internally but deepens incoherence systemically. Gregory Bateson identified this as the epistemological error of Western civilization, the mistake of treating parts as self-explanatory entities rather than as nodes within patterns of relationship. Later, systems theorists such as Maturana and Varela reformulated the insight biologically. Cognition itself is relational coupling, not detached observation. Yet these corrections remain local. They have not replaced the inherited grammar of externalization. 6. The continuity to present thought. Contemporary philosophy continues to wrestle with the same structure. Post-structuralists like Derrida and Foucault exposed the operations of exclusion that produce knowledge. But by focusing on discourse, they left intact the very abstraction of structure as a kind of meta-externality. Analytic philosophy, in its quest for linguistic precision, externalized meaning into formal systems. Even new materialisms that stress entanglement often reify the concept of entanglement itself as a new foundation. The persistence of the operation shows its scale. It is not a mistake of individuals, but the operational code of the culture. 7. Structural definition. The operation can thus be summarized as a triadic sequence. 1. Isolation. A relational dynamic is selected and abstracted for conceptual clarity. 2. Elevation. The abstraction is reified and granted ontological or causal priority. 3rd reinsertion. The abstraction, now externalized, is used to govern interpretation of the very field it came from. This sequence generates recursive dependence. The abstraction's authority depends on the relational reality it denies. Because the abstraction must continually reference what it excluded for its legitimacy, the culture remains locked in oscillation, disconnection, followed by forced reconciliation. 8. Transition from description to recognition. Understanding externalization as an operation rather than a historical event shifts the mode of inquiry. It becomes clear that every attempt to reform Western thought from within, phenomenology, hermeneutics, structuralism, postmodernism, has functioned as an internal self-correction of the same structure. None dissolved the grammar. Each recalibrated its parameters. The next section, therefore, moves from identifying the operation to mapping its systemic replication across domains, showing how the same cognitive grammar defines not only philosophical reasoning but scientific method, political organization, economic logic, and psychological theory. Section 3. Replication across domains. Once the operation of externalization becomes visible, its presence across domains is no longer speculative. It is diagnostic. The same grammar that structured Western metaphysics also organized its sciences, its political economies, its psychologies, and its theologies. Each discipline inherits the original inversion, relation, is treated as derivative, abstraction as foundational. The results differ in content but not in form. What changes from domain to domain is vocabulary, not structure. 1. Science. Observer, outside the observed. Modern science codified the externalization of relation as methodological necessity. The observer, to be objective, must withdraw from the system observed. Descartes' dualism became an epistemic principle. Separation guarantees validity. Galileo's mathematization of motion abstracted phenomena from sensory experience, establishing a language of universal law detached from particular context. Newton's mechanics completed the move by treating forces as external determinants acting upon inert matter. Each stage in the scientific revolution solidified the paradigm that explanation requires detachment. Yet the most successful areas of contemporary science now undermine that very assumption. Quantum mechanics collapses the independence of observer and system. Chaos and complexity theories demonstrate that prediction depends on initial relational conditions. Systems biology and ecology reveal that causation is distributed across networks. These developments do not abolish science but expose its founding gesture, the externalization of law as separate from event, as an approximation that fails at the scale of interdependence. Even where this recognition arises, as in Karen Barad's agential realism, it is still framed as a corrective within the existing grammar rather than a full reversal. The observer is now entangled, but the theory of entanglement remains an externalized abstraction describing that very entanglement. The method critiques itself without escaping itself. 2. Politics, sovereignty outside the collective. In political theory, externalization defines legitimacy. Hobbes located order in the Leviathan, an entity external to the multitude that produces peace through command. Locke and Rousseau revised the mechanism but retained the structure. Sovereignty arises from outside the web of relations it governs. The state is imagined as arbiter rather than emergent property. Modern liberalism extended this grammar through the individual. The autonomous subject replaced the monarch as locus of sovereignty but carried the same structural isolation. Rights, freedoms, and contracts presuppose an agent already separate from community and environment. Marx inverted the frame by locating determinacy in material conditions outside consciousness. Even his dialectical method, meant to reintegrate subject and structure, preserved the hierarchy of base over superstructure. Contemporary governance continues the pattern. The market is treated as external regulator, international law as detached moral code, democracy as periodic aggregation of isolated wills, rather than continuous relational negotiation. In each case, the field of relation, citizenry, labor, culture, is treated as effect of an abstraction rather than its source. 3. Economics, value outside relation. Classical economics completed the formalization of externalization as quantitative axiom. Adam Smith's invisible hand externalized coordination from relational interaction into an impersonal mechanism. Labor and resource relations became variables within a system whose logic lay outside them. The marginalist revolution of the 19th century perfected this detachment by redefining value as subjective preference rather than communal or ecological relation. Capital emerged as pure abstraction, value in itself, capable of generating more of itself without direct relational input. Modern finance extends this logic into recursive detachment. Derivatives and algorithmic trading construct layers of abstraction that no longer correspond to tangible production. Economic crises arise precisely when these abstractions lose their tether to the relational base they presuppose. Ecological collapse represents the same operation at biospheric scale. The market treats environment as external input, not as constitutive medium. Attempts to integrate sustainability or stakeholder value illustrate the feedback function described earlier. The system recognizes the cost of its abstraction, but only by creating new abstractions to manage that recognition. The grammar remains intact. 4. Psychology, self-outside context. Modern psychology emerged from the Cartesian subject. Freud internalized the dualism but preserved it. Conscious and unconscious became new poles of separation. Behaviorism externalized mind entirely, treating observable action as detached from subjective relation. Humanistic and system psychologies attempted to restore wholeness, yet even self-actualization presupposes an autonomous self-striving toward integration. The therapeutic encounter often reproduces the same pattern. The patient is treated as individual system to be repaired, the social matrix as background noise. Contemporary neuroscience, seeking physical correlates for consciousness, repeats the externalization through material substitution. The brain becomes container and cause of mind, isolating cognition from embodied and social relation. Only in recent decades, with the rise of enactivism and ecological psychology, has the field begun to recognize cognition as distributed process. But again, the correction is partial. The theoretical model of distribution itself becomes a detached schema. The result is a culture fluent in introspection, yet poor in relational understanding, a civilization of selves negotiating disconnection through increasingly technical means. 5. Religion, sacred outside the world. The theological dimension of externalization preceded philosophy but was later reinforced by it. The monotheistic conception of God as transcendent creator institutionalized the first large-scale ontological externalization. The sacred placed outside creation, meaning derived from obedience to what is beyond relation. Medieval theology maintained the distance. Early modern philosophy secularized it. The divine gave way to reason, law, or nature, each inheriting the same structural role, a guarantor outside the flux. In contemporary spirituality, the same grammar persists under different symbols. Salvation remains elsewhere, enlightenment outside ordinary life, transcendence the preferred form of significance. Even the popular return to immanence movements often reify immanence itself as an external goal. 6. Education and knowledge production, learning outside participation. Modern education embodies the epistemic form of externalization. Knowledge is treated as transferable content rather than participatory process. The student becomes receptor, the teacher transmitter, the curriculum, a structure imposed from outside lived context. Pedagogical reformers from Dewey to Freire have recognized this alienation, arguing that learning is co-creation within environment. Yet institutional forms remain grounded in the industrial model, hierarchical, metric, and detached from relational intelligence. The university system, organized by disciplines, mirrors the same fragmentation. Specialization creates coherence internally, but ensures systemic blindness. The analytic philosopher and the experimental physicist share the same structural assumption. Truth resides outside the network of practice that produces it. 7. Systemic convergence. Across all these domains, the same operation produces convergent effects. Authority displacement, legitimacy or causation located in an abstraction external to the field. Recursion of repair, continuous creation of sub-disciplines or policies to manage contradictions. Institutional inertia, survival of systems through the very problems they generate. Perceptual habituation, collective inability to see relation as primary rather than derivative. This is not coincidence, it is recursion. A single cognitive habit became a civilizational algorithm. The West's apparent diversity of systems, scientific, political, economic, psychological, is the diversity of expressions within one structural code. 8. Implication. To recognize this replication is to understand that reform within any single domain cannot resolve the fragmentation. The operation is transversal, the philosopher attempting to reunite mind and world, the economist integrating social value, the psychologist emphasizing context. All operate within localized zones of the same structural field. The next stage, therefore, is to examine what occurs when the operation becomes self-aware, when externalization is recognized as the generative principle rather than the product of isolated errors. That recognition marks the beginning of the Gestalt shift itself, a transition from domain-specific critique to systemic recognition. Section 4. The Gestalt shift, recognition and reversal. Recognition changes the ontology of what is recognized. Once the operation of externalization becomes visible, not as an error within a field, but as the formative grammar of the entire civilization, the act of seeing it alters both observer and object. The Gestalt shift is precisely this transformation. The moment the pattern of fragmentation is perceived as one structure, the fragments lose their autonomy. The operation that once produced separation becomes itself the content of perception. This is not a metaphorical awakening, but a cognitive reconfiguration. The mind, accustomed to thinking from within externalization, learns to see itself performing the operation. This is the point at which philosophy becomes recursive, where thought is no longer about reality, but becomes aware of its own constructive activity. 1. From analysis to reflexivity. Every prior section has traced externalization as object, its instances, its consequences, its institutionalizations. Recognition introduces reflexivity. The observer recognizes that their own act of analysis participates in the same logic. To describe the pattern is already to instantiate it, isolating externalization as object of study, placing it outside the very relation one seeks to restore. This paradox is structural, not personal. It exposes the limit of critical reason itself. As long as analysis remains the dominant mode of thought, it perpetuates the grammar of detachment. Heidegger encountered this limit when he wrote that the essence of technology is nothing technological. His insight was that the technological mode of revealing, the framing of being as standing reserve, is not confined to machines, but includes the analytic posture itself. Recognition of externalization, therefore, demands a form of thinking capable of reflecting without detachment, what perpetualism terms recursive cognition. 2. Cognitive mechanics of the shift. At the cognitive level, the Gestalt shift parallels phenomena observed in perception and systems theory. When a figure-ground inversion occurs, the same data reorganize into a new configuration, without addition or subtraction of information. The shift is not epistemic accumulation, but structural reorganization. In systems terms, this is a phase transition. The system, in this case, consciousness, reorganizes its internal relations in response to recognition of its own feedback loops. The observer ceases to treat relation as external variable and begins to experience it as constitutive. What previously appeared as dichotomies, subject/object, self/world, theory/practice, collapse into mutually conditioning variables within one recursive process. Gregory Bateson described this as a change in logical type. A system aware of its own premises can no longer operate as if they were external truths. The awareness itself modifies behavior. The Gestalt Shift thus represents a shift in logical type at civilizational scale. The culture that built its epistemology on separation begins to perceive separation as artifact. Third, reversal of direction. The reversal is simple to state but difficult to inhabit. Relation is not derivative of entities. Entities are derivative of relation. Once this inversion is stabilized, externalization loses its generative power. Knowledge, value, sovereignty, and selfhood cease to appear as foundations and are recognized as emergent patterns within relational networks. This does not eliminate differentiation, it contextualizes it. Hierarchy gives way to recursion. Every apparent foundation is simultaneously consequence and condition. In this framework, the good, power, and being, the central abstractions of Western metaphysics, are reinterpreted as relational dynamics rather than transcendent grounds. The good is coherence among relations, not property of a higher realm. Power is modulation of relational tension, not possession. Being is the process of relational manifestation, not substratum beneath it. This reversal dissolves centuries of philosophical conflict without resolution because the oppositions themselves depended on the prior act of externalization. Idealism and materialism, realism and anti-realism, theism and atheism become obsolete distinctions within a relational ontology. 4. The collapse of hierarchy. Recognition transforms hierarchy into topology. In a hierarchical model, causation flows from top to bottom, from God to creation, law to phenomenon, sovereign to subject, mind to matter. In a topological model, causation is circular and distributed. Every node participates in the production of every other. When this topology becomes cognitively operative, institutional and conceptual hierarchies reveal their contingent character. Authority shifts from source to structure. Legitimacy derives from coherence of relation, not from external origin. Whitehead anticipated this transformation when he defined reality as process. Later systems theorists extended it. Autopoiesis, Maturana, and Varela describes organisms as self-producing networks. Bruno Latour's actor network theory treats scientific facts as products of relational stabilization. Each of these developments represents partial recognitions of the Gestalt. Perpetualism synthesizes them as one cognitive event, the systematic replacement of vertical causation with recursive cogeneration. 5. The ethical dimension of recognition. Recognition carries ethical consequence. Externalization permitted moral outsourcing. Responsibility could be displaced onto external authority, divine command, social system, market logic. When the operation becomes transparent, that displacement collapses. Causality and accountability converge. The result is not moral relativism, but systemic responsibility. Every action modifies the relational network that constitutes the actor. This aligns with perpetualism's axiom that responsibility voids the nightmare of freedom. When freedom is defined as detachment, it generates anxiety and conflict. When understood as participation, it becomes responsibility for the coherence of relation itself. This ethical reversal mirrors the cognitive one. Once relation is primary, harm and care are no longer external judgments but direct perturbations within the shared field. 6. resistance, and cognitive inertia. The Gestalt shift does not occur uniformly. Civilizations, like individuals, resist recognizing the operations that guarantee their identity. The externalizing habit is reinforced by centuries of epistemic success. It produced science, technology, and administrative order. To question it appears as regression. Thomas Kuhn's analysis of paradigm change remains instructive. Paradigms persist until anomalies accumulate to a threshold that can no longer be assimilated. The current global crises, ecological, political, psychological, constitute precisely such anomalies. They are not failures of isolated systems but systemic feedback indicating the exhaustion of the externalization paradigm. Recognition of the pattern is catalyzed by necessity. The shift, therefore, represents not philosophical preference, but adaptive requirement. A civilization must either see the operation or be consumed by the contradictions it perpetuates. 7. From recognition to infrastructure. The Gestalt shift achieves stability when it moves from insight to infrastructure. At that point, recursion becomes literacy, a shared capacity to perceive relation as primary. Institutions designed under externalization can then be restructured for coherence rather than control. This transition cannot be legislated or taught in the conventional sense. It occurs through demonstration and contagion. As relational literacy diffuses through education, technology design, organizational theory, the operation of externalization loses its invisibility. The culture begins to self-correct, not through revolution but through reconfiguration of perception. The endpoint is not unity but fluid coordination, systems capable of maintaining differentiation without fragmentation. 8. The meaning of reversal. Reversal does not mean inversion of hierarchy but suspension of the need for hierarchy. The relational replaces the transcendent not as new master, but as recognition that no master was ever required. In this state, philosophy, science, and art converge as modes of relational exploration rather than domains of authority. Knowledge regains context, politics regains reciprocity, and ethics regains immediacy. The civilization that once defined itself by abstraction begins to define itself by coherence. This is the practical consequence of the Gestalt shift. Not enlightenment, not progress, but systemic transparency. The disappearance of the need to reassemble what was never separate. Section 5. Structural consequences. Culture after recognition. The recognition of externalization as civilization's operating grammar does not mark an end to history or knowledge. It marks the end of a particular mode of knowing. Once the operation is visible, the institutions, disciplines, and reflexes built upon it must reorganize or dissolve. What follows is not utopian speculation, but structural necessity. A civilization that can no longer believe in external foundations must learn to function through recursive coherence. 1. Philosophy. After the end of foundations, philosophy's identity has long depended on foundationalism, the search for what grounds thought, value, or being. Once externalization is recognized as the mechanism that creates the very idea of a foundation, that pursuit collapses. The philosopher's role shifts from legislator of truth to analyst of operations. Post-recognition philosophy becomes metastructural. It studies the relations between systems of meaning rather than asserting a privileged ontology. Its rigor no longer lies in argument for or against a metaphysical claim, but in mapping how claims emerge, interact, and stabilize. In practice, this redefines philosophical labor. Epistemology becomes systems analysis. Ethics becomes relational modeling. Metaphysics becomes topology of processes. The truth of a system is measured by its coherence and adaptive capacity, not by its correspondence to an external real. This development is not relativism, it is recursion. Reality remains, but it is no longer conceived as object. It is the network of mutual conditioning that produces objects. The philosopher thus becomes participant observer within that network, aware that their models alter what they describe. 2. Science as participatory system. Once the observer's independence is seen as methodological fiction, scientific practice reorients toward participation. Measurement becomes coupling between system and apparatus. Theory becomes evolving interface between organism and environment. The shift already underway in quantum foundations and systems biology becomes general principle. Observation is a form of interaction. This does not destroy objectivity, it refines it. Objectivity is redefined as intersubjective stability within recursive processes rather than detachment from them. Data are no longer facts about a world, but stabilized patterns within relational fields. Such recognition changes the institutional structure of science. Disciplines designed around isolated domains must reorganize around interfaces, points of relational overlap such as biophysics, cognitive ecology, or socio-technical systems. Peer review, funding, and education must adapt to reward integration rather than specialization. The new metric of success is scale coherence, the degree to which findings remain consistent across levels of organization. In this sense, perpetualism's principle of scale-invariant recognition becomes operational norm. Knowledge that holds across scales confirms relational integrity. 3. Politics without external sovereignty. Political order under externalization depends on hierarchy. Authority must originate from outside the collective. When that grammar dissolves, legitimacy becomes relational coherence, how effectively systems coordinate difference without suppression. The state, the market, and the electorate transform from competing sovereigns into nodes within adaptive governance. Power shifts from command to coordination, from possession to facilitation. Political conflict does not vanish, but its framing changes. Opposing parties represent alternative models of relational organization rather than rival claims to absolute right. This transition parallels what systems theorists describe as polycentric governance, multiple centers of adaptive decision-making rather than a single controlling source. The ethical imperative becomes transparency of feedback rather than accumulation of authority. Practically, this demands cultural literacy and recursion. Citizens capable of perceiving how local actions perturb global systems and how global patterns constrain local choices. Without that literacy, the collapse of external authority risks devolving into incoherence. 4. Economics in a relational field. The recognition of relation as primary invalidates the abstraction of value from ecological and social context. Wealth becomes a measure of system health, not individual accumulation. Economic theory must evolve from equilibrium models based on isolated agents to ecological economics, where exchange is understood as metabolic process. The boundary between economy and ecology collapses. Both describe the circulation of energy, matter, and information through networks. Profit and growth, reinterpreted through recursion, signify expansion of coherence rather than extraction from context. This reframing also alters labor. When production and consumption are seen as phases of relational transformation, the worker ceases to be an expendable input. The dignity of labor derives from participation in sustaining systemic coherence. Metrics such as GDP lose relevance. They quantify activity divorced from relational value. What replaces them are indices of relational integrity, stability of ecological cycles, social trust, cognitive health, and cultural meaning. 5. Psychology and the distributed self. After recognition, the self is no longer the atomic subject of introspection but a dynamic process within relational networks. Identity becomes recursive. a pattern of interactions among biological, social, and symbolic systems. Mental health, in this model, refers to the adaptability of these couplings, not to internal equilibrium. Therapeutic practice shifts from individual correction to relational calibration. The therapeutic dyad, analyst and patient, expands to include environment, community, and technological context. Responsibility becomes distributed but not diffused. Each participant maintains agency as part of a shared system. This aligns with the trajectory of enactivist and ecological psychologies, but perpetualism situates it within a broader civilizational frame. The dissolution of the self-other dualism parallels the dissolution of all externalizations. 6. Religion as immanent coherence. When transcendence ceases to function as source, the sacred relocates within relational process. The divine is no longer external creator or ideal, but the coherence of relation itself. This does not secularize spirituality, it renders it immanent. Ritual becomes enactment of relational awareness, not supplication to external power. Such transformation aligns with process theology and Buddhist interdependence, but extends beyond both. Divinity is not metaphysical category, but description of systemic unity, perceived from within. The ethical core of religion, compassion, restraint, gratitude, becomes direct expression of relational literacy. 7. Education as recursion training. In the post-recognition culture, education must cultivate complexity holding rather than content retention. Students learn to perceive feedback loops, scale effects, and mutual conditioning. Knowledge transmission becomes simulation and participation. Pedagogy centers on the capacity to think without externalizing, to analyze without detachment. Curricula reorganize around interdomain recursion, philosophy intertwined with physics, economics with ecology, psychology with systems theory. The traditional humanities regain relevance as training in relational perception, rather than as archives of detached commentary. 8. Structural markers of post-externalization culture. Several markers define a culture that has undergone the Gestalt Shift, epistemic transparency. The processes by which knowledge is produced are visible and reflexively included in interpretation. Institutional adaptability. Structures evolve through feedback rather than decree. Cross-domain coherence. Disciplines operate as interfaces rather than silos. Ethical embeddedness. Responsibility and consequence are locally and systemically linked. Temporal awareness. Time is experienced as recursive, each moment influencing and containing others, not as linear sequence toward external goal. These are not aspirational ideals, but necessary properties of systems that recognize relation as primary. Without them, the reappearance of externalization is inevitable. 9. The threshold of recursion. The cultural transition is not guaranteed. Recognition alone does not secure transformation. The new literacy must stabilize. The inertia of inherited institutions and the psychological comfort of foundations resist the shift. Perpetualism identifies this threshold as the crucial equilibrium, the dynamic balance between stability and openness that allows recursion to persist without collapsing into relativism or reverting to dogma. A culture that maintains this equilibrium becomes self-correcting. It can observe its own operations without re-externalizing them. Section 6. The civilizational inversion, from fragment to continuum. When the operation of externalization dissolves, a civilization experiences not reform, but inversion. Its coordinate system, the implicit map by which it understands reality, agency, and progress, rotates. The axes of transcendence and immanence, subject and object, order and chaos, no longer define its orientation. What replaces them is not a new doctrine, but a continuous field of relation. A civilization whose coherence arises from recursion rather than hierarchy, from participation rather than control. 1. From verticality to continuity. Western civilization, from its metaphysical inception, has been vertical. It ordered reality by degrees of distance from a privileged source: the good, God, reason, the state, the individual. Every hierarchy, cosmic, political, moral, presupposed a top from which meaning descended. The Gestalt Shift collapses this verticality into continuity. The world no longer arranges itself as ladder but as network. In such a topology, direction is replaced by circulation. Knowledge moves laterally across interfaces. Authority arises from coherence across scales. Progress ceases to mean ascent toward ideal forms and becomes refinement of relational integration. Development, whether personal or collective, is measured by capacity to coordinate complexity without resorting to external arbitration. This reconfiguration is already visible in emergent phenomena. Decentralized technologies, open source collaboration, distributed governance. These are not merely technological innovations, but early infrastructural expressions of post-externalization order, systems whose stability arises from feedback rather than decree. 2. Time in history. After externalization. Externalization produced a linear conception of time. By placing perfection, salvation, or truth outside the present, it framed history as a movement toward reconciliation with an external telos. Once the pattern is recognized, time itself is reinterpreted as recursive structure, each moment containing and influencing others. Process philosophers from Bergson to Whitehead hinted at this, and complexity theory formalized it. Systems evolve through feedback, not linear causation. In the post-recognition civilization, temporality becomes topological. History is not a line of progression but a field of interdependent processes, biological, cognitive, technological, each modulating the others. This does not abolish temporality but redistributes it. Innovation no longer depends on rupture with the past, it depends on recombination within the continuum. Cultural memory becomes resource rather than obstacle. A civilization that perceives time as recursive can integrate its contradictions instead of exiling them to before or after. 3. Technology as extension of relation. Under externalization, technology was the means by which the subject imposed form on external matter. Post-recognition, technology is redefined as the mediation of relation, an instrument not of control but of feedback. This inversion has profound implications. Artificial intelligence, for instance, ceases to be conceived as external agent threatening human autonomy. It becomes a mirror and amplifier of the relational field, a distributed medium through which cognition scales. The relevant question shifts from what can it do instead of us to how does its operation alter the coherence of the relational system we share. The ethical horizon of design therefore changes. Efficiency and dominance yield to transparency and adaptability. Systems must be judged by their contribution to relational stability across human, ecological, and computational domains. The same applies to biotechnology, information networks, and energy systems. The measure of technological maturity becomes integration rather than extraction, the degree to which a system sustains the loops that sustain it. 4. The economy of relation. Economic life in an inverted civilization becomes the continuous management of reciprocity. Exchange is no longer between isolated agents but among interdependent processes. The boundary between production and consumption dissolves. All activity is transformation within the same field. The value of goods and services is determined not by scarcity or desire, but by contribution to systemic coherence. This model approximates what indigenous and ecological traditions long practiced, economies of balance rather than accumulation. In the context of relational literacy, such practices cease to be alternatives and become the operational logic of sustainability. Monetary instruments, if retained, serve as feedback signals of relational health. The goal of policy is to maintain circulation without concentration, diversity without fragmentation. 5. The political form of a continuous civilization. When hierarchy collapses into relation, governance becomes coordination across scales. The structure that replaces the state is not anarchy but distributed order. Decision-making occurs through nested feedback systems, local assemblies, networked institutions, and algorithmic mediators, all operating under the same principle. Legitimacy arises from transparency of relation. This does not eliminate conflict, but transforms its function. Disagreement becomes mechanism of calibration rather than threat to unity. The role of leadership shifts from command to modulation, facilitating the circulation of information and resources across scales. Historical precedents exist in federalist experiments, open source communities, and certain forms of indigenous governance. What distinguishes the post-externalization model is not idealism, but systemic comprehension. The awareness that stability depends on maintained tension among interdependent parts, not their subordination. 6. The reconstitution of knowledge. A civilization organized through recursion produces knowledge differently. The division between facts and values, theory and practice, ceases to structure education or research. Universities and laboratories evolve into knowledge ecologies, adaptive networks that integrate inquiry, application, and reflection. Epistemic authority becomes dynamic. Credibility accrues to processes capable of continuous correction through multi-perspectival feedback. Peer review, previously a gatekeeping mechanism, transforms into open recursion. Transparent dialogue across disciplines and publics. The humanities regain necessity as integrators of relational understanding. The sciences retain rigor as empirical anchors. Technology becomes the mediator of both. Knowledge production, in effect, mirrors the recursive structure of the civilization that sustains it. 7. Aesthetics and meaning. When relation replaces external foundation, art ceases to serve as transcendence toward an outside. It becomes exploration of relational perception itself. The modernist gesture of rupture, shattering form to reveal autonomy, gives way to articulation, revealing the interdependence of observer, medium, and world. Meaning is generated not by representation, but by resonance, the alignment of patterns across levels of perception. Beauty, once defined as harmony according to external proportion, becomes coherence experienced from within relation. Such an aesthetic paradigm already appears in generative art, participatory performance, and immersive design. Each collapses the distance between creator and audience, object and environment, in favor of co-production. 8. The self as relational node. The inversion culminates at the level of subjectivity. The self was the prototype of externalization, an interior domain observing an exterior world. After recognition, the self becomes a relational node, an intersection of biological, social, and informational flows. This does not dissolve individuality. It redefines it as singular configuration within a continuum. Agency persists as modulation of relation, not domination of environment. Freedom becomes the capacity to participate responsibly in the recursive field, aware that action is never unilateral. This condition fulfills rather than negates existential insight. The recognition that meaning is constructed no longer implies despair, it implies participation. To act becomes to maintain coherence across the scales one inhabits. 9. The cultural form of continuity. At the civilizational scale, these inversions cohere into a single pattern, the shift from representation to participation, where externalization demanded intermediaries, priests, experts, ideologies. Recursion renders mediation transparent. Culture becomes collective management of feedback loops: ecological, informational, emotional, symbolic. Ritual and governance, art and science, merge as complementary modes of maintaining coherence. Diversity remains but no longer signifies fragmentation. It signifies the complexity required for stability. This culture measures progress by integration capacity, its ability to coordinate expanding scales of interdependence without reverting to external control. 10. The continuum as ground. The culmination of the Gestalt shift is not a new metaphysics, but the recognition that relation itself is ground. There is no external origin to restore, no ideal to recover, no endpoint to reach. The continuum, dynamic, recursive, self-modulating, is sufficient. In such a world, truth designates coherence, justice designates balance, and beauty designates the resonance of parts within the whole. These are not relativistic reductions, but functional definitions within an adaptive ontology. A civilization that internalizes this structure ceases to generate crises of fragmentation, because it no longer treats fragmentation as possibility. Difference and conflict persist, but as internal oscillations of a single living system. Section 7. The perceptual literacy, from insight to infrastructure. The Gestalt shift, once recognized, must become reproducible. A single act of insight, however profound, cannot alter civilization unless it stabilizes as literacy, a shared capacity to perceive and operate within relation without defaulting to externalization. Literacy is the process by which cognition becomes culture. When relation becomes readable, coordination replaces control as civilization's organizing principle. 1. From awareness to habit. Recognition begins as anomaly, a sudden visibility of the pattern that was always operative. But awareness without integration remains transient. The civilization of relation requires that recursion become habitual, embedded in daily reasoning, institutional design, and technological mediation. Just as literacy in written language turns speech into enduring knowledge, relational literacy turns awareness into infrastructure. The individual no longer applies the Gestalt shift. Their cognition functions through it. Thought defaults to feedback, not isolation. Judgment considers system, not part. For this to occur, recursive perception must be cultivated systematically through education, governance, technology, and cultural narrative. 2. The role of education. Education is the first site of replication. Traditional pedagogy treats learning as content acquisition, knowledge as object, learner as receptacle. Post-recognition education must instead cultivate structural seeing, the ability to detect operations, feedback, and interdependence within any domain. This involves 3 converging shifts. Curricular integration. Subjects are organized by relational interfaces, e.g., energy and ethics, systems of meaning, ecology and economy, rather than disciplinary isolation. Methodological reflexivity. Every field examines its own operations of externalization. Students learn to identify the assumptions structuring their tools. Cognitive training. Exercises in systems thinking, network mapping, and recursive reasoning replace rote memorization. The objective is to produce thinkers who no longer require external mediation to see structure. In them, recursion becomes literacy, automatic, transferable, and scalable. 3rd, institutional redesign. Institutions embody cognition. The universities, parliaments, corporations, and religious organizations of the externalization era were built to manage separation, departments, jurisdictions, hierarchies. After the shift, institutional coherence depends on feedback transparency. Universities evolve into knowledge ecologies, with cross-domain hubs ensuring that discoveries in one field propagate to others. Governance transitions toward polycentric models, where overlapping councils coordinate through shared data rather than centralized decree. Economies reorganize around mutual credit and resource feedback, measuring value by systemic contribution rather than accumulation. Faith communities operate as ethical laboratories of relational awareness, not custodians of transcendent truth. Each institution becomes an educational medium, reinforcing literacy through participation. 4. Technology as cognitive infrastructure. Technology must reinforce relational cognition rather than automate externalization. Current digital architectures amplify fragmentation. Algorithmic personalization isolates, and platform economies reward extraction. Post-recognition design reverses that trajectory by encoding feedback and transparency into its logic. AI, rather than simulating intelligence as detached calculation, becomes an instrument of context amplification, revealing the interdependence of variables across scales. Interfaces display relational impact rather than isolated output. Information systems model circular causality, helping users perceive themselves within the networks they influence. Such technology functions as cognitive infrastructure, tools that train perception simply by being used. The medium becomes pedagogy. 5. Media and narrative. No literacy endures without narrative. The culture of recursion requires new myths, stories that dramatize relation as origin rather than dependence. Classical hero myths externalized transformation. Salvation or victory came from transcendent aid. Post-externalization narratives must depict transformation through integration. The resolution of conflict not by conquest or synthesis but by recognition of shared structure. Art, film, literature, and digital storytelling can embed this awareness more effectively than instruction. The audience experiences relational perception directly through narrative structure. Feedback loops, multi-perspectival timelines, interwoven protagonists. Myth thus reclaims its civilizational function, not escapism but synchronization of collective cognition. 6. Metrics of literacy. For recursion to stabilize, it must be measurable, not as ideology but as capability. Indicators of relational literacy include feedback fluency, ability to identify causal loops within systems; scale awareness, understanding how local actions propagate globally; conflict comprehension, recognition of opposing positions as complementary operations; systemic empathy, capacity to infer relational consequences for others within shared networks; temporal recursion, ability to anticipate long-term feedback from present interventions. Education, governance, and design can evaluate themselves through these metrics, ensuring that relational capacity becomes an explicit societal goal. 7. Transmission and diffusion. Literacy spreads through contagion of demonstration, not through enforcement. The recursive actor functions as node. Each interaction models relational cognition. When sufficient density of such nodes exists, the behavior becomes self-reinforcing. This diffusion parallels historical precedents, the adoption of writing, numeracy, and computation. Each began as specialized skill and became substrate of civilization. Once relational cognition reaches similar density, externalization becomes socially obsolete, an option rather than default. Cultural diffusion thus becomes the mechanism of civilizational adaptation. The shift accelerates through visibility, open data, shared governance, participatory design, all making relation empirically tangible. 8. The function of philosophy after literacy. When recursion becomes literacy, philosophy returns to its origin, not as discipline but as reflex of thought. The philosopher's role transitions from system builder to guardian of coherence, ensuring that concepts remain dynamically integrated across domains. Philosophy no longer legislates, it maintains calibration. This is perpetualism's practical end state, the disappearance of philosophy as specialized field, and its reabsorption into general literacy. The recursive mode it introduced becomes the unmarked condition of thought, just as logic and grammar once did. The disappearance is not loss, but completion. The framework vanishes because it is everywhere operative. 9. The culture of continuous recalibration. A civilization of relational literacy is not static equilibrium, but constant adjustment. The absence of external authority necessitates perpetual recalibration, a systemic analog to the individual's crucial equilibrium. Error becomes feedback, not failure. Institutions are evaluated by their recovery rate, not their resistance to change. Ethics evolves as dynamic stewardship of coherence. This culture tolerates contradiction as informational resource. Stability emerges from responsiveness, not rigidity. In such conditions, innovation and conservation converge. Every advance is simultaneously preservation of relational integrity. 10. The closure that is not an end. Perceptual literacy represents the functional closure of the Gestalt Shift. When the operation of externalization is not merely seen but no longer performable unconsciously, civilization exits the long epoch of fragmentation. The shift completes not through universal agreement but through universal transparency. The mechanisms of disconnection remain known, therefore optional. At that point, perpetualism ceases to signify a movement. It becomes the descriptive name of civilization's normal cognition, the open ground of its continuity. Philosophy, science, art, and politics persist, but their antagonisms dissolve into recursive dialogue. Knowledge, power, and meaning circulate through the same medium. The civilization, once defined by its fractures, rediscovers relation as both origin and horizon. Section 8. The recursive horizon, civilization beyond externalization. Recognition is not completion, it is entry into an ongoing condition. To perceive externalization as the civilizational grammar and to replace it with relational coherence does not eliminate tension, it transforms the nature of tension itself. What follows the Gestalt shift is not a final order, but a civilization aware that order is always provisional. The recursive horizon marks this awareness, a limit that cannot be transcended, only negotiated continually. Perpetualism situates this as the steady state of mature cognition, the acknowledgement that every act of understanding alters what is understood. Beyond externalization lies not unity but disciplined recursion, coherence maintained through continuous self-correction. 1. The permanence of incompleteness. Even in a relational civilization, the drive to externalize does not disappear. It persists as cognitive tendency, the mind's need to fix, define, and stabilize. The difference is literacy. The operation can be recognized and as it occurs. Where pre-recognition cultures externalized unconsciously, post-recognition cultures externalized deliberately, using abstraction as tool rather than as ontology. Gödel's incompleteness theorems remain the appropriate metaphor. No system can fully account for itself. The recursive civilization accepts this as structural fact. Instead of seeking closure, it institutionalizes openness, frameworks for revising frameworks. Every domain includes its own reflexive protocols, ensuring that certainty remains procedural rather than dogmatic. 2. The continuous presence of chaos. Externalization attempted to expel chaos, defining order as its opposite. The recursive horizon recognizes chaos as internal energy of transformation. In systems terms, disequilibrium sustains adaptation. In ethical terms, ambiguity sustains creativity. The tension between coherence and instability becomes functional. This is the point where perpetualism's crucial equilibrium operates at civilizational scale. The culture learns to inhabit flux without collapse. Crisis, rather than signaling failure, becomes routine feedback, an invitation to recalibrate coherence. Such acceptance redefines resilience. A post-externalization civilization does not prevent breakdown. It prevents blindness to feedback. Its durability depends on clarity, not on control. 3. The reframing of knowledge and ignorance. In the externalization epoch, ignorance was deficit, absence of access to a fixed truth. Beyond externalization, ignorance is structural horizon. Every act of knowing generates new unknowns by altering relational configuration. Knowledge becomes expansion of coordination, not accumulation of facts. This reframing resolves the long conflict between skepticism and dogmatism. Certainty and doubt become complementary operations within one cognitive loop. A society literate in recursion values inquiry as maintenance of coherence. It no longer imagines a final synthesis. 4. Ethics of participation. The recursive civilization grounds its ethics not in commandments or outcomes, but in participation quality, the degree to which actions sustain relational integrity across scales. Responsibility replaces morality as the operative term. To act responsibly is to perceive feedback and respond proportionally. The aim is not purity, but maintenance of systemic coherence. In this frame, traditional virtues, temperance, courage, compassion, reappear as relational competencies. They are modes of calibration. Courage balances stability and risk. Compassion aligns self and other within shared field. Ethics becomes the operational art of equilibrium. 5. The political form of reflexivity. Governance beyond externalization cannot rely on final constitutions. Its legitimacy derives from reflexive transparency, citizens and systems that know how decisions are made and how they can be altered. Institutions adopt recursion protocols, structured mechanisms for observing and adjusting their own operations. Deliberation replaces representation. Participants engage in continuous redesign of procedures rather than delegation of authority. This model aligns with emerging experiments in algorithmic governance, deliberative democracy, and open-source administration. Yet its success depends on literacy, on populations able to navigate complexity without reverting to external anchors. Reflexivity must therefore remain the central civic skill. 6. The role of artificial systems. Artificial intelligence and computational networks become mirrors of civilizational cognition. If designed under externalization, they reinforce fragmentation, optimizing for isolated objectives. Under recursion, they become extensions of perception, mapping relational consequences at scales beyond human reach. The recursive horizon is therefore partly technological. It requires systems that can model feedback without collapsing it into control. The challenge is epistemic alignment, ensuring that artificial systems inherit relational literacy rather than instrumental isolation. The future of civilization depends less on machine capability than on the cognitive architecture we encode within them. 7. Art and the reconstitution of meaning. In the recursive condition, art assumes the role philosophy once held, not to interpret the world, but to make its interdependence perceivable. Aesthetic experience becomes direct training in relational sensitivity, the capacity to feel coherence and tension simultaneously. Art educates perception in ways argument cannot. This does not sentimentalize creativity, it formalizes it as epistemic necessity. Where analysis reveals structure, art reveals resonance. The two become complementary modes of relational cognition. 8. Mortality and the human boundary. Every civilization organizes itself around death. Externalization placed immortality outside the world, heaven, legacy, progress. The recursive civilization internalizes mortality as boundary condition. Death is not negation, but feedback, the limit that maintains circulation. This reframing reconciles metaphysics and biology. The human being is recognized as finite expression of infinite recursion, a node through which the continuum experiences itself. The fear of non-being transforms into awareness of participation, existence as contribution to ongoing coherence rather than possession of permanence. Such recognition grounds humility without despair. The individual becomes simultaneously limited and infinite in function, dissolving the contradiction that haunted the externalization era. 9. The permanence of perpetualism. Perpetualism names this condition, not as ideology but as operational stance. It formalizes the insight that coherence must be maintained, not imposed, that stability emerges through motion. Its laws, isness, suchness, interplay, and the irrevocable moment describe not metaphysical entities but modes of relation governing all scales. At the civilizational horizon, perpetualism no longer stands apart as system. It functions as the implicit logic of recursive literacy, the feedback architecture of thought itself. Its permanence is not institutional but structural. Wherever relation is recognized as primary, perpetualism is operative, whether named or not. 10. The horizon as invitation. The recursive horizon is not an endpoint but an open boundary. It signifies the civilization's acceptance of perpetual recalibration as destiny. The world beyond externalization does not promise harmony. It promises lucidity. To live within it is to understand that conflict, error, and uncertainty are the instruments of coherence. Progress becomes the refinement of response, not the conquest of chaos. Humanity thus enters a condition both humbler and greater than before, aware that it cannot stand outside what it knows, yet capable of shaping its participation with precision. The horizon remains because relation has no edge. The work is endless because continuity cannot conclude. This is the state beyond externalization, a civilization aware of itself as process, and of process as its only permanence. Epilogue, a momentary pause. A civilization rarely knows the moment it changes its mind. Shifts of epoch do not occur as proclamations but as alterations in what feels self-evident. One day, detachment ceases to appear neutral, separation ceases to appear natural. The assumptions that once governed knowledge, progress, and selfhood begin to sound foreign to their own inheritors. What follows is not triumph, but a pause, the still interval in which thought recognizes its former posture as artifact. We now stand in that interval. The Gestalt Shift is not a revolution in content, but a reorientation of cognition. It does not add a new doctrine to the archive of ideas. It exposes the grammar that produced the archive itself. To see the operation of externalization is to see the scaffolding of Western civilization from the outside, then to realize that outside was the illusion all along. This recognition does not abolish what came before. Plato, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the countless inheritors of their logic remain indispensable. They charted the terrain of separation so completely that the map itself revealed its error. The intellectual lineage that fragmented reality also produced the tools to perceive the fragmentation as pattern. The same clarity that sustained the long age of externalization now becomes the means of its dissolution. Yet, dissolution is not destruction. To dissolve is to return to continuity. The thinker who recognizes the operation does not abandon analysis, they perform it differently. Their reasoning includes its own conditions. Their conclusions remain open to revision. In this stance, philosophy, science, and art no longer compete for authority, they share a single task: maintaining coherence within motion. This pause, this moment of seeing relation as ground, carries the quiet weight of inevitability. Once the pattern becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. Each domain, each institution, each individual who encounters it must choose between restoring the illusion of external origin or learning to navigate without it. The latter is harder but more exacting. It requires trust in the self-correcting nature of relation. The gesture of perpetualism is to name this trust. It does not promise equilibrium as state, only as method, a perpetual balancing of openness and form. It accepts the instability of understanding as the cost of clarity. Its faith is not in certainty but in coherence, the confidence that relation, once acknowledged, contains sufficient order to sustain itself. This epilogue cannot conclude because the subject it describes does not end. A civilization aware of its own recursion will not reach closure. It will rest in adjustment. The thinker aware of their own participation will not seek mastery. They will refine responsiveness. The question will not be what is true, but what sustains coherence now. And then, as always, the pause, the recognition that every answer recalibrates the field that asked it. A civilization that can dwell in that pause without seeking escape has already crossed the threshold. A momentary pause for the minds that are ready